Hello and welcome to the Military History Club's Great Battle in 10 Minutes feature. Today I'm talking about the Dieppe Raid of the 19th of August 1942, the largest and most expensive operation of its kind during the Second World War. Of the 5,000 or so Canadian and British troops involved, more than 70% of them were killed, wounded and captured. They had been sent on Mission Impossible. The initial incentive for such an operation had been to relieve pressure on Russia. In early September 1941, with the German invasion of Russia just 6 weeks old, Lord Beaverbrook, the influential Minister for Aircraft Production, had urged Churchill either to open a second front on the Cherbourg Peninsula or to undertake a super raid to give Stalin proof of British goodwill. Within a month, Churchill had appointed Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten, a dashing but some said incompetent naval officer and distant cousin of the king, as advisor on combined operations. Mountbatten's task was twofold: to harass the enemy by continuing the program of raids begun by his predecessor, Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, and to prepare for the eventual invasion of Europe. The raiding program in particular would convince the skeptical Americans of Britain's fighting resolve. It did not seem to matter that the 41-year-old Mountbatten, whose only claim to fame was the gallantry he had shown during the quite unnecessary torpedoing of two of his destroyers, and the sinking of another, was totally unqualified for the job. In January 1942, Mountbatten's staff drew up a schedule of operations for the year. It included raids on Ostend and Saint-Nazaire in March, Bayonne in April, German-occupied Alderney in May, Dieppe in June and July, and an ambitious attempt on the German headquarters in Paris in August. Dieppe was chosen, according to Captain John Hughes Hallett, the principal naval planner, for no particular reason originally except that it was a small seaport and we thought it would be interesting to capture a small seaport for a time and then withdraw. It was not thought to be of any particular military importance, and it appeared that it would be about the scale of objective that would be suitable for a divisional attack. The stakes were upped in February 1942 when Stalin publicly declared that he was willing to negotiate with Hitler's Germany. With much of European Russia already overrun, Stalin was trying to frighten his Western allies into relieving some of the pressure. Hitler certainly thought so, noting in a March directive that the Western powers would be impelled by obligations to allies and political considerations to launch raids on mainland Europe. Consequently, he ordered all troops in coastal areas to be kept on high alert. The Führer's instinct was spot on. In a panic, Churchill asked his senior military advisors, including Mountbatten, to make proposals for a sacrifice operation in France in July to keep Russia in the war. While most suggested temporary bridgeheads or super raids, Mountbatten resurrected Beaverbrook's idea of seizing the Cherbourg Peninsula and holding it indefinitely. Impressed by Mountbatten's audacity, Churchill made him a permanent member of the Chiefs of Staff Committee with the rank of Vice Admiral. As it happened, the Cherbourg expedition was ultimately rejected as impractical, while most of the raids were cancelled for one reason or another. This still left Churchill needing a propaganda coup to satisfy the Russians, and Mountbatten, with just one small-scale success at Saint-Nazaire in March to his name, needing to justify his appointment. To meet both requirements, Mountbatten resurrected the most ambitious of the raids, a large-scale assault on Dieppe. It was an unfortunate choice. Just 70 miles across the channel from New Haven, the town lies nestled in a narrow gap between high chalk cliffs. The entrance to the harbour is on the extreme eastern end of the seafront. The rest of the town is fronted by a pebbled beach. To defend this beach, the Germans had fortified the two-storey casino at the western end of the esplanade, placed machine gun nests all along the house fronts, and built pillboxes at both ends. In conjunction with guns sited in caves on both headlands, these strongpoints provided enfilade fire right along the beach. Further protection was provided by a cordon of field batteries, some 2 miles inland, and 2 heavy 6-gun batteries on cliffs either side of the port. Stationed in and around Dieppe was the second-rate German 302nd Infantry Division, with its headquarters half an hour's drive to the south. In the town itself were 2 battalions, 1,500 men, of the 571st Regiment, while its other battalions guarded the batteries on the cliffs. Behind the town was stationed cyclist reserves, and within a day's march was the crack SS Adolf Hitler Brigade. Further inland at Amiens was the veteran 10th Panzer Division, recently returned from the Eastern Front. By now, the plan to assault Dieppe had undergone a number of changes. At first, combined operations had favoured flanking attacks, with paratroopers knocking out the coastal batteries and infantrymen advancing from nearby beaches to link up inland. Later, it was felt that these attacks alone would not be strong enough to take the town, and so a major frontal assault was added. But this created its own problems. So many simultaneous assaults were bound to cause a naval traffic problem. The agreed solution was for the flanking attacks on the clifftop batteries to precede the main assault by half an hour. As a result, the frontal attack lost the element of surprise. A further blow to the expedition in early June was when the preliminary bombardment was cancelled. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, from whose southern command the troops were drawn, and the force commanders had made this recommendation on the ludicrous grounds that it would restore the element of surprise and facilitate the movement of the tanks which were to be landed. Originally scheduled for June, the raid was postponed after 2 unsuccessful dry runs on the Dorset coast, emphasised the difficulty of synchronising so many separate assaults. Bad weather then prevented it going ahead in early July. This time, however, the men had been fully briefed and actually loaded aboard the transport vessels. Fearing a security risk, Montgomery recommended that the raid be cancelled for good. So too did the naval force commander. Both were hastily cut out of the chain of responsibility. The choice of formation to carry out the main attack, the Canadian 2nd Division, was also unfortunate. Comprised mostly of volunteers, it had been in Britain since December 1940 and had yet to see action. The long period of boredom had resulted in low morale and poor discipline, with more than 70 officers and 3,200 other ranks court-martialed for various offences, mainly absence without leave, misconduct and drunkenness. On the 31st of July, Combined Operations issued the preliminary order for the raid, codenamed Operation Jubilee, although it was never formally authorised by the Chiefs of Staff Committee. The final plan was as follows. 3 and 4 commandos would land at 4:50 a.m. on beaches near Berneval and Varengeville, 3 miles either side of Dieppe, and deal with the 2 clifftop batteries. Simultaneously, 4 infantry battalions would put in flank attacks from beaches at Puy and Pourville, 1 mile east and 2 miles west of the town respectively. Half an hour later, the rest of the force, 3 infantry battalions, a tank regiment, and a Royal Marine Commando, would assault the town head-on. Having pushed the tanks as far afield as Arques, about 4 miles south of the town, the whole force was to withdraw. The great armada of vessels carrying nearly 5,000 Canadians and 800 commandos set sail during the evening of 18 August. Next morning at 1:27 a.m. and again at 2:44 a.m., Hughes Hallett, the naval commander, received Enigma decrypts warning that an armed German convoy was steaming towards Dieppe. He decided not to cancel the mission. The men of 3 commandos suffered the consequences. At 4 a.m., not far from the shore, their 23 Eureka landing craft and gunboat escort had the misfortune to bump into the German convoy. Only 7 craft survived the unequal firefight and pressed on. 6 of them managed to land about 100 men on Yellow Beach, near Berneval, but the Germans had been alerted and the commandos failed to get anywhere near the battery. Only 1 of them made it home. The rest were killed, wounded, and taken prisoner or captured unwounded. The other craft, carrying Major Peter Young and 18 men, landed without opposition on Yellow Beach too, near Belleville. Having scaled the cliff, they engaged the troops defending the battery and kept the guns quiet for 2 hours. Only a lack of ammunition caused them to break off the fight and return to their landing craft. There were no casualties. A little further west at Puy, the assault by the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Black Watch of Canada was even more calamitous. Landing 15 minutes late and 8 minutes after the Germans had sounded the alert, they were cut to pieces on the beach by machine gun fire from just 60 defenders. So heavy was the fire that many landing craft turned back, still laden with troops. Of the 600 or so men that were put ashore, only 6 returned home unwounded. The other flank attack at Pourville was marginally more successful. With the Germans only aware of their presence at the last moment, the men of the South Saskatchewan Regiment got ashore relatively unscathed. They came under heavy fire, however, as they attempted to cross the Sea River, where their commanding officer won the Victoria Cross for his gallant leadership. Once over, they continued their advance for a further 2,000 yards until heavy opposition forced them back. By now, they had linked up with their follow-up battalion, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and together they fought on until their ammunition ran out. In all, the Saskatchewans lost 517 men, the Cameron Highlanders 346. Further west near Varongaville, Fort Commando was achieving the only tangible success of the day. Half the force under Major Derek Mills Roberts had landed on time at a beach below the lighthouse with the task of climbing a narrow gully and advancing to the edge of the town, where it was planned to provide covering fire for the assault group led by Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovett, which was to silence the battery there. But no sooner had the first force landed than the battery opened fire on offshore shipping. Aware that Lovett's party would not be in position for some time, Mills Roberts decided to attack at once with his own force. By the time the second group arrived to begin the assault, Mills Roberts' men had been engaging the battery and its defenders for more than half an hour. 2 officers were killed and many men wounded in the first rush, but the attack was continued by Captain Pat Porteous, who led a battery charge through the wire to the final position before being shot in the thighs and falling into one of the gun pits. For this gallant feat, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Having taken and destroyed the battery at a cost of 12 men killed, 20 wounded and 13 missing, Fort Commando returned to the beaches and re-embarked. The biggest disaster of the day was the frontal assault on Dieppe. It started well enough with 2 Canadian battalions, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish, arriving on schedule, and the Germans momentarily stunned by an air raid, but the fire support from sea and air was hopelessly inadequate, and the Germans quickly recovered. As the first landing craft disgorged their men, the defenders opened up with machine guns, mortars and artillery. Decimated by this withering fire, the survivors of both battalions were forced to take refuge behind the low seawall that separated the pebbled beach from the esplanade. It did not help that the 27 Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment, the 2nd Division's main source of firepower, arrived 15 minutes late. Even then, with their trucks unable to grip the loose shingle, they presented an easy target, and most did not make it off the beach. A few isolated infantry units actually made it into the town, but they could accomplish nothing and were eventually killed or captured. In an attempt to bolster the assault on the eastern half of the beach, General Ham Roberts, the divisional commander, sent in the Fusilier du Mont Royal. Unfortunately, they landed in the wrong place and were quickly pinned down with the rest of the troops. By now, the beach was a death trap, swept from end to end by machine gun fire, bursting shells, and flying shingle. The dead and dying lay in heaps, but still the force commanders would not admit defeat. At 8:30 a.m., in a desperate last throw, Roberts ordered A Royal Marine Commando to land. As they emerged from a smokescreen 200 yards offshore, they were met by a murderous fire. Their CO, Lieutenant Colonel Picton Phillips, made a brave decision to abort the mission, but was killed as he stood up to wave the landing craft away. Half an hour later, a general evacuation was ordered, but it was all but impossible under such a heavy fire, and the majority were forced to surrender. At 12:50 p.m., when a lone destroyer made a last brave attempt to discover if there were any survivors, all that could be seen were lifeless bodies, burnt-out tanks, and landing craft littering the shore. The final casualty list was appalling. Of the 4,000 Canadians who landed, 800 were killed and 1,900 captured. A further 466 naval and commando personnel were lost, not to mention 1 destroyer, 33 landing craft, and all the 27 tanks. In addition, 105 RAF fighters were shot down in what proved to be one of the greatest air battles of the war. German casualties were just 600 men, including the pilots of 91 planes the British claimed to have shot down. The enemy admitted to 48. Predictably, Mountbatten put the disaster down to bad luck, bumping into the armed convoy and to the incompetence of General Roberts, who wouldn't follow my plan on a frontal assault without preliminary bombing. In fact, Mountbatten's staff had approved all the changes to the plan, and he himself, for reasons of personal gain, had ensured the mission went ahead in its final form without the formal authorization of the Chiefs of Staff. One of Montgomery's biographers described Mountbatten as a master of intrigue, jealousy, and ineptitude. Like a spoilt child, he toyed with men's lives with an indifference to casualties that can only be explained by his insatiable, even pathological, ambition. Thank you.